So let's talk about one kind of rare but exciting Warhammer 40K tactic that might just have the potential to flip games from wins to losses. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk through one interesting 40k tactic that maybe doesn't really come up all that often, but when it does it could be absolutely massive, potentially putting one player absolutely enormously on the back foot right from the word go. In this video I'm talking about move blocking things on the first turn of the game. I'm basically aiming to leave a frustrated opponent with a whole load of really valuable assets, pinned back behind a wall of chaff and not able to get to the midfield objectives or any of your good stuff. I'd say in general this is an option that you're probably not going to be making use of in the vast majority of games, not unless perhaps you're specifically building your list to design around doing this. It's not really something that all armies have equal access to and can do well. You either need good scouting units or infiltrators or just extreme fast movers. And it also doesn't really work equally against all enemy armies or deployment zones or missions. And then beyond that usually means that you have to have first turn as well, all of which have to kind of go in your favour. If you've got some good cheap mid-board units to play with turn 1 though, it definitely could be worth looking out for this in situations where it matters really big. Keeping the most important parts of the opponent's army well back from the midfield in the early game is a big deal in a game that only has 5 turns. Move blocking in general in Warhammer 40k is really quite a big thing, and is pretty much as useful in 10th edition as it was before in the game. Unlike days in the past where you might be able to tank shock enemies out of the way and things, in general models in the game have the design idea that they just can't be moved out of the way by your opponent at will. Plenty of units might be able to move through or over them, like things with the fly keyword, but unless you've actually damaged and destroyed the enemy's units, then they'll stay where they are until you do so. Beyond that, in movement in 40k, you can't move within engagement range of any enemy units in the movement phase, so basically enemy units have a sort of exclusion zone of 1 inch around them, which means that even units that should in theory have some fairly small footprints can take up really quite big chunks of the board. Maximally spread out, even something like a unit of 5 Space Marine Scouts can really take up a big chunk of the board if they're deployed at full coherency of 2 inches away from each other plus the width of their bases. It's definitely useful to have going on throughout the game, and you certainly can get opportunities to do it as things go on. Say in this example, the Space Marine Scouts are trying to hold back the Chaos Terminators, moving really up close to them and spreading out, and as the Chaos Terminators only have a 6-inch move characteristic, they're not going to be able to have enough movement to go around the Scouts, and also be able to charge the Space Marine Gladiator tank that's sat on the objective, which is what they really like to do. As the Scouts are just in front of them, they can't really move forward any great distance either. And even if they did so and then gunned down the Scouts later in the turn, you might have a very long charge to try and make the charge on that tank, or it might just be completely impossible. It's maybe quite a big implication of shooting happening in the movement phase, and then only having so much charge range threat after that. In general, move blocking shenanigans against really big things like monsters and vehicles that want to be in combat but can't move through things like ruined walls, and that might mean that they have a narrow movement lane that they have to go through, which you could easily block off with chaff infantry. It might also be more valuable to do so on these sort of things, as they are often quite valuable miniatures. Maybe things like the Avatar of Cain or Imperial or Chaos Knights might be good examples. It could easily be worth sacrificing a cheap unit for a turn if it keeps them at bay and not doing anything. It's certainly a bit easier to do with things that don't fly. Say things like a Chaos Space Marine Mauler Fiend might be able to be stopped at a choke point literally by a single infantry base. But even on things that in theory should be able to move past your units might often not have the clearance to be able to do so. Say for example Mortarion or an Imperial Knight Gallant, they might have enough clearance to get their base past the front rank of your troops, but unless they can get the back part of their big base 1 inch clear of the back rank of your units, they won't actually have anywhere that they can legally land the other side of you, so they might still just be equally hemmed back, unless they were absolutely right up next to your squad when they tried to start moving. This one's definitely a bit more true now the fly rules don't work anywhere near as well with terrain, and big flying monsters can't just go straight through it. Basically, move blocking things throughout the game is really quite powerful. You can stop enemy units reaching and killing a more important unit than you're screening things. You could stop them reaching an objective or the unit that's guarding it, meaning that you score points and the enemy doesn't. Or you could stop things like your ranged damage dealers getting locked up in combat, which they really might not want to be and have the difficult decision as to whether or not to fall back. In this one though, I really wanted to focus on the possibility of doing it on a slightly catastrophic first turn sort of level, in the rare opportunities where you get to basically do a move block, but on basically the entire enemy army's most important units at the same time. Just for one example, say your opponent was playing Imperial Knights, they set up their army like this, really just going fairly maximally front and centre to go around the ruin in the middle in two different ways to get to those two objectives. A few knights aiming to go around the periphery, but absolutely the core of their force wanting to stride towards those centre points and take the middle of the board right from turn 1. For this one, it could perhaps be pretty brutal if once the knight player is deployed, you see that there's the option to really get in the way quite a lot and position some infiltrators or fast movers to just move into the places between those two movement lanes. Then all the armigers won't be able to get through. They're standard vehicles and don't have anything to allow them to ghost through enemy units. And in this case, it looks like the big knight's deployed just a little bit too far back. He's not right on the edge of the deployment zone. So it basically doesn't look like he's going to have the clearance to get over this screen of gargoyles here. And it's also going to be pinned back in their own deployment zone turn 1. This would be kind of horrific for the knight player, as they'd not be able to get basically any of their units outside of their deployment zone turn 1. They'd just basically be able to nose up to the edge of it and delete that screen of gargoyles, shoot any guns that they have past them, but basically be watching those primary objectives be out of reach, at least until they get their second movement phase. In general, these sort of shenanigans tend to be best if the enemy units are either slow or ground-bound, maybe heavy infantry that are really going to feel having to move around an annoying screen of units and just aren't going to be able to do that very efficiently, or big heavy hitters like the knights that have to go down certain movement lanes where you really have the opportunity to get in their way. It's also going to be way more important if the opponent's deployed really bunched up, having say all their force castled together. If they do that, then you might be able to just slow that entire formation down. And it's just not going to be quite as doable if they've got forces all over the front line. You're not going to be able to focus and expend one unit to slow down a bunch of their army. The terrain and the mission map could be quite important as well. It'll be a lot easier to do on things like hammer and anvil when you're playing from the short board edges and the front line isn't really all that big. And particularly if your opponent's only got a few movement lanes that they can properly use for their army, if they're very mechanised or playing knights or something. It's also perhaps a bit more important if the opponent's going to be doing an entire ton of their damage dealing at short range, so either actually needing to get their units into combat or wanting to have some close range shooting on the go against your forces. I feel like in general that's going to be a good way of limiting more of the value of their army right from turn 1, compared if they had, say, a mechanised gunline type army, and they could still have a turn where they can get a lot of value out of just shooting loads out of their deployment zone and still taking down a chunk of your force that might have moved up to expose itself. Even in that case, though, I still think it's kind of big to be able to lock their firepower into their own deployment zone. It'll likely mean that you'd have the choice of what sort of things you can hide from them quite a bit better, and still denying them getting to objectives and things is pretty big. For some examples of those, I feel like Imperial or Chaos Knights are perhaps some of the easiest ones. They're always going to be locked down to movement lanes, even if the Armigers and War Dogs do move pretty fast. Any other enemy army going very mech heavy, though, definitely has the potential to have the same problem. Maybe a massive Death Star castle built around slow-moving, heavily armoured infantry, if they don't have any redeployment type options, and have just got one big castle in one part of the board, then you could maybe hold that all back with a couple of units of screening chaff. Perhaps from the new codexes, Necrons with multiple Catan could be interesting. If they're transcendent Catans or teleporting around in the Hypercrypt Legion, then I guess that's not as relevant. But maybe for a more standard Necron list with a Void Dragon and a Nightbringer in it, both deployed near each other, keeping both of those hemmed back behind a unit of screens for a turn could be kind of nice. Otherwise, I guess it could be nice for slower moving Horde style type armies if someone's playing something a bit more off meta and a massive amount of bodies on the table. They usually tend to excel by flooding the midfield objectives and then fighting the opponent there. If you can hem the bodies back into their own deployment zone, then they'll likely be tripping over each other quite a bit and not really have any good room to manoeuvre. And again, that could be pretty painful for a slightly slower moving and lumbering army. Basically, I feel in some situations you can basically look at the points cost of the unit that you've got as your screens or scout move type units and see whether or not it's going to be worth just hemming the entire enemy army back, and whether or not that's likely to be worth the trade-off, both from costing the enemy some damage output and also stopping them getting to any primary objectives. I feel like it's perhaps more of a valid tactic than it was in previous editions in 40k, with 5 turns in a game. Having an important chunk of the opponent's army not really very active for one of them could be a huge deal. As for units to actually do all this nastiness with, there's quite a few options, though as mentioned, not every army has access to particularly great ones to do it with. Maybe something that could be an option for some armies a bit more than others. Ideally, you'd want the units doing it to be really quite cheap. If you were sacrificing something like 200 or 300 points to pull this off, then you might not really be putting your opponent behind at all, and they might just take the kills and move on. And I guess ideally you'd want a unit that takes up a fairly big amount of board space. Smaller units and vehicles and things could block some move gaps between terrain, but wouldn't really be very effective against doing this sort of thing against infantry. Then though, there's a few different ways to get units actually to the front of the enemy army right from turn 1. You basically have 3 options as either fast moving scouts, units with infiltrates, basically any sort of those will do, or some things that can move excessively fast, often things that maybe might be able to move, shoot, move, and also have a fast movement characteristic. They might be able to get there, as not really that much else has the movements to cross entire deployment zones. Out of these two, I'd say that the fast moving scouts or the fast moving units might be the best ones to go for it, as you are going to have to commit them prior to knowing whether you get first turn or not. With scouts or fast movers, you could just have them in position to potentially try and do this, whereas infiltrators, they get close by actually physically being there, so they might get hit first if you go second. I guess you could still maybe have it a bit of a halfway house, maybe put them in some cover in the midfield. At least the opponent might have some trouble dealing with them then, at least compared with sitting right out in the open. Out of those categories, here are just a few ideas. Necron Tomb Blades both have scout and move shoot moves, so have enough movement to get basically wherever they want. They're perhaps a bit on the pricey side for expendable screens, but could certainly do the job if it was going to have enough value. Otherwise, things like Eldari Shroud Runners, Scout Sentinels for the Imperial Guard may be broadcasted with some orders towards them, or Admech Cerberus Raiders, with their big bases they can cover really quite a lot of distance if they were strung out in a big line. For infiltrators, I guess you'd want them as cheap as possible. I feel like Chaos Nurglings seem about as ideal as they come. 35 points for each squad of 3 of them, fairly durable. And I feel like if you did lose a couple of units of these guys that were trying to go for this cheekily if you happen to get first, then it's not exactly the biggest loss in the world. They might even debuff enemy units with -1 to hit if they do move up too close to them. Otherwise, basically anything else that infiltrates could do the trick. Scouts, Eldari Rangers, Sicarian Infiltrators, or all sorts of other things, ideally as cheap as possible, and if they do have the scout keyword then so much the better. That might allow them to either move a bit further forward or pull a bit back, depending on whether you go first or second. Otherwise, for things that move just really fast, perhaps Tyrannic Gargoyles seem like one of the god tier units for this. They get to move 12 inches, advance, shoot, and then move again, potentially getting very close to 24 inches worth of movement out of them. On really quite a cheap unit that's got 10 models in it as well, so you could cover really quite a lot of the enemy front line. I feel like just putting 10 of these in the way of the enemy army is not going to be very popular with some factions, or bonus points if you used a big 20 of them in Unending Swarm, just promptly swarm them forward and then respawn to them when the enemy inevitably killed them. Otherwise, not too many things can move that fast without being quite expensive. Eldari Warp Spiders could, I guess. They do seem a bit pricey for this kind of sacrifice though, maybe getting into the area where it might not be such a great idea. Otherwise, here's just a few other thoughts about the tactic. If you needed a bit more movement or some better positioning, you could potentially try and charge something safe to get the screen in place, maybe an outlying enemy transport unit. Potentially certain units like say Kasachan Jungle Fighters that scout move 6 inches, they could be getting long charges off into the enemy deployment zone if both units deployed on the front lines. That could be one way to hold up enemy units, and you might still have some good movement freedom with the rest of the squad that didn't actually have to get into base contact. 10th edition charge rules might make things bunch up a bit though. Otherwise, for ways for this to go wrong, Overwatch could be one counter. If the opponent's got an enormous unit of flamers or something, then just having them delete your screen would not be a good time. Depending on the army though, even something like a single infantry model could hold up a bunch of vehicles. Still might be worth the risk. Behind the screening units, you probably want to leave a good gap. You don't really want the opponent just to shoot down your screening unit, then charge the thing behind it. Ideally, you'd want to make that charge very long or undoable. And you certainly wouldn't want anything so close that the enemy just charges into the screening unit and then consolidates into the next thing. That wouldn't be great either. Otherwise, if the opponent's got loads of shooting damage dealers, it probably makes sense to play cagey with the rest of your force. You don't want them just lit up and gone down while they're held in place in the deployment zone, otherwise it's not really a turn wasted. I guess ideally you'd want to inflict some safe damage where possible, take safe objectives, but not really have the heart of your force just blown up from a whole bunch of enemy units that can't move very far. Otherwise, I would say that this is probably the sort of thing that might work well against an enemy army once, but definitely could be kind of easy to foil with certain list building things or just different deployment, depending on the deployment map. If the opponent doesn't just bunch everything up or has some scouts or infiltrators to screen of their own, this might well just not be doable. But I feel like it happens rarely enough that it might occasionally catch people by surprise. It's not really all that often that people play for aggressive board control in 40k in such a massive major way right from turn 1. In any case, hope you enjoyed a few thoughts on that. Let me know if you've seen this come up before at all in any games. I've certainly seen a few times where I've seen it done, and definitely had people notice in hindsight that it might have been able to be done to my knights on occasion, which certainly would have flipped one draw into an easy loss for me. Look forward to hearing any stories down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to keep new ones coming just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few other advantages as well, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.